The rain fell heavily on the streets of Chicago that cold November evening. Marcus stood outside the glass window of Bellissimo, an upscale Italian restaurant in the heart of downtown. His worn coat, once black but now faded to a dull gray, hung loosely on his thin frame. Through the steamy window, he could see well-dressed people, laughing, eating, and enjoying their expensive meals. The warm yellow light inside seemed like a different world, one he no longer belonged to. His stomach growled painfully. It had been 2 days since his last proper meal, a half-eaten sandwich he found near a park bench. Marcus pressed his hand against his empty belly and took a deep breath. Pride had kept him away from begging, but hunger was a powerful force that broke down all walls of dignity. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, and immediately all eyes turned toward him. The conversations seemed to pause for a moment. A hostess in a crisp white shirt and black vest approached him quickly, her smile tight and professional. "Sir, I'm sorry, but we require proper attire," she said, her eyes scanning his dirty shoes and threadbare clothes. Marcus noticed the other diners staring at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to disgust. He felt his face grow warm with embarrassment, but he stood his ground. "I don't want to eat here as a customer," Marcus said quietly, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I saw you have a piano in the corner. I can play just for some food. Anything you have left over?" The hostess's eyes widened in surprise. A few people at nearby tables started whispering to each other. One man in an expensive suit laughed out loud, the sound cutting through the restaurant like a knife. "Did he just say he'll play piano for food?" The man said to his dinner companion, not bothering to lower his voice. "This is priceless." More laughter rippled through the restaurant. A woman in pearls shook her head and turned back to her meal, clearly uninterested. The hostess looked uncomfortable, glancing back toward the kitchen, as if hoping the manager would appear and handle this awkward situation. "Sir, I really think you should leave," she said, though her tone had softened slightly. "I can get you some bread to take with you, but let him play," a voice called out from across the room. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. An elderly woman with silver hair sat alone at a corner table, her meal barely touched. She wore an elegant burgundy dress and had the bearing of someone who was used to being listened to. "Excuse me," the hostess said. "I said, let him play," the woman repeated, her voice stronger now. "What harm can it do? If he's terrible, we'll know in 30 seconds. If he's not, well, we might enjoy some music with our dinner." The hostess looked toward the manager, who had finally emerged from the kitchen. He was a short, stout man with a thick mustache, and he looked annoyed by the interruption to his evening service. "Mrs. Castellano," the manager said, recognizing the elderly woman. "Are you certain?" "Quite certain, Antonio," she replied firmly. The manager sighed and waved his hand dismissively at Marcus. "Fine. 5 minutes. 1 song. Then you take whatever Giuseppe has left in the kitchen and you leave. Understood?" Marcus nodded quickly, hardly believing his luck. He made his way through the maze of tables toward the baby grand piano that sat in the corner of the restaurant. It was a beautiful instrument, its black surface polished to a mirror shine. He could see his own reflection in it, and he barely recognized himself. His face was gaunt, his cheeks hollow, and his eyes had dark circles beneath them. He sat down on the bench and lifted the floorboard to reveal the ivory keys. His hands, dirty and trembling slightly, hovered over them. It had been so long, so terribly long since he had touched a piano. For a moment, fear gripped him. What if he had forgotten? What if his fingers no longer remembered what his mind could barely hold on to? Behind him, he heard someone mutter, "This is going to be a disaster," followed by more quiet laughter. Marcus closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He thought back to a different time, a different life. He remembered the first time his mother had placed his small hands on piano keys when he was just 5 years old. He remembered the countless hours of practice, the competitions, the concerts. He remembered the feeling of the music flowing through him, becoming part of him, making him feel alive and whole. His fingers found their place on the keys. The first note rang out clear and pure, cutting through the murmur of the restaurant like a bell. Then another note, and another. Marcus began to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major Mo, one of the most beautiful and technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. The transformation was immediate and complete. The laughter stopped. The whispered conversations ceased. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Even the kitchen staff, hearing the music, came to stand in the doorway to listen. Marcus's fingers danced across the keys with a grace and precision that seemed impossible for someone who looked so broken down by life. The music swelled and flowed through the restaurant, each note perfect, each phrase shaped with deep understanding and emotion. This was not the playing of an amateur or even a competent musician. This was the work of a master. The elderly woman, Mrs. Castellano, set down her wineglass and stared at the pianist with an expression of wonder. The man in the expensive suit who had laughed earlier now sat with his mouth slightly open, his dinner forgotten. The hostess stood frozen near the entrance, her eyes wide. Marcus poured everything he had into the music, all his pain, all his loss, all his longing for the life he had once lived. The notes seemed to carry his story without words, speaking of heights reached and falls taken, of brilliance dimmed but not extinguished, of hope that refused to die even in the darkest circumstances. As he played, tears ran down his face, but he didn't stop. The music had to come out. It had been locked inside him for too long, and now it flooded forth like water from a broken dam. His 5 minutes came and went, but no one moved to stop him. The entire restaurant had become his audience, held captive by the beauty of what they were hearing. When the final note faded into silence, no one moved. No one spoke. The moment hung in the air, sacred and profound. Then, slowly, Mrs. Castellano began to clap. Others joined her, and within seconds, the entire restaurant had erupted into thunderous applause. People rose from their seats, some with tears in their own eyes. Marcus opened his eyes, disoriented, as if waking from a dream. He looked around at the standing ovation, unable to process what was happening. The manager stood near his table, his face pale, his earlier annoyance completely vanished. For the first time in years, Marcus allowed himself to feel something other than shame and despair. But he had no idea that this single performance was about to change everything, or that among the diners that night was someone who held the key to his past and possibly his future. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity to Marcus. He sat at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys, unable to fully comprehend the response. This was so different from the mockery and laughter that had greeted him just minutes earlier. He slowly stood up, his legs shaky, and gave a small, awkward bow. "Incredible!" someone shouted from the back of the restaurant. "Absolutely incredible." Antonio, the manager, hurried over to Marcus. His expression completely changed. Gone was the irritation and dismissal. Now his eyes shone with something close to reverence. "Sir, please, come with me," Antonio said, gently touching Marcus's elbow. "Giuseppe will prepare a proper meal for you. Whatever you want." Marcus followed him, toward the kitchen, still dazed. As they walked, diners reached out to touch his arm or pat his shoulder. A young woman with red hair pressed a $20 bill into his hand. An older gentleman tried to give him a business card, but Marcus's hands were too full to take it. In the kitchen, the chef, a large man with flour on his apron, immediately began preparing food: pasta primavera, fresh bread, and some chicken masala, Giuseppe announced. "And tiramisu for after. A musician like that needs proper fuel." Marcus sat on a stool near the prep counter, watching the organized chaos of the kitchen. The smell of garlic and herbs made his stomach clench with anticipation. It all felt surreal, like a dream he might wake up from at any moment. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Antonio asked, pulling up another stool. That was not the playing of a street musician. That was conservatory level. Maybe beyond. Marcus hesitated. Talking about his past felt like opening a wound that had never properly healed. But the kindness in Antonio's eyes made him want to answer. "I studied at Juilliard," Marcus said quietly. "Graduated top of my class. I was supposed to be someone. I had concerts booked, a recording contract waiting. Everything was lined up. What happened?" Antonio asked gently. Before Marcus could answer, Mrs. Castellano appeared in the kitchen doorway. The staff immediately straightened up, showing her deep respect. She moved slowly but deliberately, her cane tapping against the tile floor. "I need to speak with this young man," she said. It wasn't a request. Antonio quickly brought her a chair, and she sat down across from Marcus. Up close, he could see that she was older than he had first thought, probably in her 80s, but her eyes were sharp and clear, missing nothing. "I am Sofia Castellano," she said. "My late husband founded the Chicago Symphony's scholarship program. I have attended concerts for over 60 years. I know talent when I hear it." She paused, studying Marcus's face, "and I know tragedy when I see it." "What happened to you?" Marcus felt his throat tighten. Giuseppe placed a steaming plate of pasta in front of him, but suddenly he wasn't sure he could eat. The memories he had worked so hard to bury were rising to the surface. "My wife Alina," he finally said. "We were married just 8 months when it happened. She was a violinist. We were going to perform together, build a life making music. But there was an accident. A drunk driver ran a red light." Mrs. Castellano reached across and placed her aged hand on his. She didn't say anything, just waited. "She died instantly," Marcus continued, his voice breaking. "I was driving. I survived without a scratch. Not physically, anyway." The guilt was unbearable. "I kept thinking if I had taken a different route, if we had left 5 minutes later, if I had seen the car coming sooner. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't play." "How long ago?" Mrs. Castellano asked softly. 3 years, Marcus replied. 3 years and 4 months. I cancelled all my performances. Let the recording contract expire. I couldn't imagine making beautiful music when I had caused such an ugly thing to happen. My agent tried to help. My friends tried, but I pushed everyone away. Eventually, I ran out of money. Lost my apartment. Started drinking, and ended up here, like this." Giuseppe had stopped cooking to listen. Antonio wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. Even the sous chef, a tough-looking young man with tattoos, looked moved by the story. "You didn't cause anything," Mrs. Castellano said firmly. "A drunk driver caused it, not you. And your Alina, did she love your music?" Marcus nodded, tears streaming down his face now. "She loved it more than anything. She said when I played, she could see colors. She said my music made the world make sense." "Then the greatest dishonor you can do to her memory is to let that gift die with her," Mrs. Castellano said. "She would want you to play. She would want you to live." Marcus knew she was right. He had known it for a long time, but hearing someone else say it made it real. He picked up his fork and began to eat. The pasta was the most delicious thing he had tasted in years. But it wasn't just the food. It was the act of accepting kindness, of allowing himself to be cared for again. As he ate, people from the restaurant kept coming to the kitchen to see him. A teenager asked if he could take a video next time Marcus played. A businessman offered to pay for more performances. An elderly couple said the music had reminded them of their wedding day 50 years ago. But the most interesting visitor came last. A man in his 40s, wearing jeans and a casual blazer, stood in the kitchen doorway. He had been sitting at a small table near the back during Marcus's performance, and Marcus hadn't noticed him at all. "Excuse me," the man said. "I don't want to interrupt, but I had to speak with you. My name is David Chen. I'm a music producer. I was here having dinner with my mother for her birthday when you played." Marcus looked up, his fork paused midway to his mouth. "I record classical music for streaming services and film soundtracks," David continued. "I work with smaller independent artists, help them get their music heard. That performance you just gave, it was extraordinary. I recorded part of it on my phone. I hope that's okay." Marcus felt a flutter of something he hadn't felt in years. It might have been hope, or it might have been fear. He wasn't sure which. "I want to be straight with you," David said, pulling up a chair. "I'm not offering you $1 million contract, or promising to make you famous. But I have a small studio, and I have connections to people who appreciate real artistry. If you're interested, I'd like to record you properly. Maybe put together an album. See where it goes." "I don't have anywhere to live," Marcus said bluntly. "I don't have clean clothes. I don't even have a toothbrush. We can work on all of that, David replied. I have a small apartment above my studio that's currently empty. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and clean. You could stay there while we work. In exchange, you give me your music. That's the deal. Marcus looked at Mrs. Castellano, who smiled and nodded encouragingly. He looked at Antonio and Giuseppe, who were grinning broadly. He thought about Alina and what she would want him to do. Why would you do this for someone you don't know? Marcus asked. Someone who was begging for food an hour ago. David smiled. Because about 15 years ago, I was a struggling musician sleeping in my car. Someone gave me a chance when they didn't have to. I'm just paying it forward. Plus, selfishly, I think your music could be something special. Something people need to hear. Marcus took a deep breath. Accepting help felt terrifying. It meant hoping again, trying again, risking failure again. But sitting in that warm kitchen, surrounded by strangers who had become kind faces, he realized he had a choice. He could continue down the path he was on, slowly fading away into nothing. Or he could take this chance. Honor Elena's memory by doing what she loved most about him. Okay, Marcus said quietly. I'll do it. The kitchen erupted in cheers. Giuseppe brought out the tiramisu, Antonio produced a bottle of wine. And soon, half the restaurant staff was crammed into the kitchen, celebrating this unexpected turn of events. David exchanged phone numbers with Marcus, which felt absurd, since Marcus didn't have a phone. But David said he'd fix that too. As the celebration continued around him, Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. It was small, fragile, and could easily be crushed. But it was there. A tiny seed of belief that maybe, just maybe, his life wasn't over. Maybe this was not an ending, but a beginning. What none of them knew was that Marcus's performance had been seen by more than just the people in the restaurant. The teenager who had asked to video him had already posted the clip online, and it was beginning to spread. By morning, thousands of people would watch it. By the next week, millions, and among those millions would be people from Marcus's past who thought they would never hear from him again. The apartment above David's studio was small but clean, just as promised. One room with a bed, a tiny bathroom, and a kitchenette. To Marcus, who had spent the last 6 months sleeping in shelters and under bridges, it looked like a palace. David had given him the key, some basic groceries, and toiletries. He also left a note saying Marcus should rest and come down to the studio whenever he was ready. That first night, Marcus took a hot shower that lasted almost 40 minutes. He stood under the water until it ran cold, washing away layers of grime and shame. When he finally looked at himself in the mirror, he could begin to see the person he used to be underneath the beard and hollow eyes. He looked like a ghost of his former self, but at least now he looked like a ghost that might possibly return to life. He slept for 14 hours straight, the first peaceful sleep he'd had in years. No sirens, no cold wind, no fear of being robbed or moved along by police. Just silence and warmth and a soft bed. When he woke up, sun was streaming through the small window. For a moment, he panicked, thinking it had all been a dream. But then he saw the clean clothes David had left folded on a chair, the groceries in the kitchenette, and he knew it was real. Marcus made coffee and toast, simple things that felt extraordinary. Then he went downstairs to the studio. David was already there, working at a computer surrounded by sound equipment, keyboards, and guitars. Morning, David said with a smile. Or should I say afternoon. It's almost 1 o'clock. Sorry, I didn't mean to sleep so long, Marcus said. Don't apologize. You needed it. Come, let me show you around. The studio was larger than Marcus expected. There was a main recording room with excellent acoustics. A control room with all the technical equipment, and in the corner, a beautiful Steinway grand piano that made Marcus's heart skip a beat. I know it's not a concert grand, David said, noticing Marcus's gaze, but it's a good instrument, properly maintained. You can play it whenever you want. Marcus approached the piano slowly, almost reverently. He ran his fingers along its edge, then sat down at the bench. It felt right, like coming home after a long journey. There's something you should know, David said, pulling up a chair. That video from last night. It's going viral. The teenager who filmed you posted it online, and it's spreading fast. You have over 2 million views already. Marcus felt his stomach drop. What? David turned his laptop around to show him. There, on the screen, was Marcus playing at belly sync. The video quality wasn't great, shot from a phone, but the audio was clear enough. The title read, "Homeless Man Plays for Food, Turns Out to Be Incredible Pianist." The comments section was flooded with reactions. People were amazed, moved, asking who he was and where they could hear more. Some were criticizing the people who had laughed at him. Others were sharing their own stories of loss and comeback. "I know this probably feels overwhelming," David said gently, "but this is actually good. People are interested. They want to hear more. This gives us momentum." Marcus scrolled through the comments, his hands shaking slightly. Then he saw one that made his blood run cold. It was from someone named Jennifer_Hartley, and it said, "That's Marcus Wilder. He was a student of my father's at Juilliard. We've been looking for him for 3 years. Someone please tell me where he is." "I need some air," Marcus said, standing up abruptly. He went outside and walked around the block several times, his mind racing. Jennifer Hartley. He remembered her, though they hadn't been close. Her father, Professor Thomas Hartley, had been one of his most influential teachers. The man had believed in Marcus, pushed him, shaped his interpretation and technique. After Alina died, Professor Hartley had tried repeatedly to reach out, but Marcus had changed his number and disappeared. The shame of it washed over him. All those people who had cared about him, worried about him, and he had vanished without a word. He had been so consumed by his own pain that he hadn't considered how his disappearance might affect others. When he returned to the studio, David was on the phone. He held up a finger, indicating he'd be done in a moment. "Yes, that's right. Thursday afternoon would work." "Thank you so much for your interest," David said, then hung up. That was the local news station. "They want to do a story on you." "No," Marcus said immediately. "I can't. I'm not ready for that." "Okay," David said calmly. "I understand. But Marcus, you should know that your phone has been ringing all morning. I've been screening calls. There's a professor from Juilliard trying to reach you. Someone from the Chicago Tribune wants an interview, and about a dozen people claiming to be old friends." Marcus sat down heavily. This is happening too fast. Yesterday, I was sleeping in a shelter. Today, I'm some kind of viral sensation. I can't process this, David nodded. "I get it. But here's what I'm thinking. We control the narrative. You don't have to talk to anyone you don't want to. But we could make a proper recording, release it on our terms. Tell your story the way you want it told, otherwise, everyone else will tell it for you." Marcus knew he was right. The internet didn't wait for people to be ready. It consumed stories and spit them out, often distorted beyond recognition. "What did you have in mind?" Marcus asked. "I want to record you playing several pieces. Not in one day, but over the next few weeks. We'll take our time, get it right. While we're doing that, we can decide how much of your story you want to share. Maybe we do one interview with someone trustworthy, give people the basic facts, and then focus on the music. Let the music speak for itself." Marcus thought about it. The idea of people knowing his story, knowing about Alina and his fall from grace, made him feel exposed and vulnerable. But David was right. The story was already out there. The video was spreading. He could either hide from it or face it head-on. "There's something else," David said. "Mrs. Castellano called this morning. She wants to sponsor a concert. A real concert, at a proper venue. She has connections with the Chicago Cultural Center. She thinks she can arrange something for next month." Next month? Marcus's voice rose in panic. "That's too soon. I haven't performed in years. I'm not ready." "I'm not," Hey David interrupted. "Breathe. It's just an idea. Nothing is set in stone. We'll only do what you're comfortable with." Marcus forced himself to take slow, deep breaths. He realized he was having a panic attack, something that had become common after Elena's death. The walls felt like they were closing in. The room seemed too small, too bright, too loud. "I need to play," Marcus said suddenly. "I need to play right now." He went to the Steinway and sat down. His fingers found the keys and he began to play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. The music flowed through him, anchoring him, bringing him back to himself. This was the language he understood, the way he made sense of the world. David quietly set up microphones around the piano. He recorded everything, but he didn't interrupt. He just let Marcus play. Marcus played for 3 hours straight. He played pieces he had learned as a child, pieces he had performed at Juilliard, pieces he had played for Alina. With each note, he felt a little more like himself. Not the broken person he had been for the past 3 years, but not quite the confident performer he had been before either. Someone new, someone shaped by loss, but not destroyed by it. When he finally stopped, his hands were tired, but satisfied. David came out of the control room with tears in his eyes. "That was beautiful," David said. "And I got all of it." "Marcus, I've worked with a lot of musicians, talented people, skilled people. But what you have is different. It's not just technique. It's truth. You play like someone who has lived, who has suffered, who has something real to say." Marcus felt a lump in his throat. Alina used to say something similar. She said, "I played pretty before we met, but after I loved her, I played with soul." "She was right," David said, "and I think she would want you to keep playing. Not despite what happened to her, but because of how much she meant to you. Every note is a way of keeping her alive." That evening, Marcus made a decision. He called the number Jennifer Hartley had left in the comments section. She answered on the second ring. "Marcus." Her voice was full of emotion. "Is it really you?" "It's me," he said quietly. "I'm sorry I disappeared. I'm sorry I worried everyone. We just wanted to know you were okay," Jennifer said, starting to cry. "My father never gave up hope. He always said you'd come back when you were ready." "Is he still teaching at Juilliard?" Marcus asked. "Yes, he's there now. He's older, slowed down a bit, but he still takes students." "Marcus, can I tell him I found you? It would mean the world to him." Marcus hesitated, then said, "Yes, tell him. And tell him I'm playing again. I'm not the same person I was, but I'm finding my way back." They talked for another hour. Jennifer told him about what had happened at Juilliard since he left, about other students they had known, about her father's health struggles and recovery. She didn't push him to explain where he had been or what he had done. She just welcomed him back, as if the 3 years of silence hadn't happened. When Marcus finally hung up, he felt lighter. The shame was still there, but it was manageable now. He had taken the first step toward rebuilding the bridges he had burned. The video continued to spread like wildfire across the internet. By the end of the week, Marcus's performance at Bellissimo had been viewed over 10 million times. News outlets picked up the story. Morning talk shows called music blogs wrote lengthy pieces analyzing his technique and emotional depth. The narrative wrote itself. Homeless man revealed as musical genius. A story of tragedy and possible redemption. Marcus tried to ignore most of it. He focused on what he could control, which was his music. Every day, he spent hours at the Steinway in David's studio, relearning pieces he hadn't touched in years, working through the rust that had accumulated in his fingers and mind. David recorded everything, building a library of material they could potentially use. But the outside world kept pushing in. Mrs. Castellano called almost daily with updates about the concert she was organizing. She had secured the Chicago Cultural Center's Preston Bradley Hall for a date 6 weeks away. The venue held over 200 people, and she promised that every seat would be filled with people who appreciated serious music. Not just curiosity seekers drawn by a viral video. "You need new clothes," David said one morning, looking at Marcus's borrowed outfit. "If we're going to do this concert, you need to look the part." They went shopping together, something Marcus hadn't done in years. David picked out several dress shirts, pants, and a proper concert suit. Marcus felt strange trying on expensive clothes, seeing himself look professional again. The man in the mirror was starting to resemble the Marcus Wilder who had graduated from Juilliard. Though his eyes were different now, carrying weight they hadn't before. Your hair and beard need attention too, David said diplomatically. At a barbershop, Marcus sat in the chair and let the stylist work. As his beard came off and his hair was trimmed and styled, another layer of his homeless persona fell away. The transformation was both relieving and unsettling. He wasn't sure who this new Marcus was supposed to be. The real test came when Professor Thomas Hartley called. Marcus had been avoiding the conversation, afraid of disappointing the man who had once seen so much potential in him. Marcus, the professor's voice was warm, but carried the weight of age. I cannot tell you how good it is to hear you're alive and playing again. Professor Hartley, Marcus said, his voice catching. I'm sorry I disappeared. I'm sorry I wasted everything you taught me. Wasted? The professor laughed gently. My boy, I watched that video. You haven't wasted anything. If anything, you've deepened. There's a maturity in your playing now that wasn't there before. Pain does that sometimes. It either breaks an artist or makes them profound. You've chosen profound. They talked for over an hour. The professor told him about current students, about changes at Juilliard, about his own health issues. He had suffered a minor stroke 2 years ago, but recovered well. He was 78 now, thinking about retirement, but not quite ready to let go. I want to come to your concert, Professor Hartley said. If that's acceptable to you. I'd like to see what you've become. I'd be honored, Marcus replied, though the thought of performing in front of his old teacher terrified him. But Professor, what if I'm not good enough anymore? What if I've lost it? Impossible, the professor said firmly. Talent like yours doesn't disappear. It might sleep, but it doesn't die. Trust yourself, Marcus. Trust the music. As the concert date approached, Marcus threw himself into preparation. He selected his program carefully. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece he had played at Bellissimo. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, and several pieces by Schubert and Debussy. It was an ambitious program, over 90 minutes of music, but he felt ready. David arranged one interview with a respected music journalist from the Chicago Tribune. Marcus agreed to talk about his story, though he insisted on keeping some details private. When the journalist, a woman named Sarah Martinez, came to the studio, Marcus found her easy to talk to. I'm not interested in exploiting your pain, Sarah said honestly. I want to write about your music and your comeback. The human interest angle is important, but it's secondary to the art itself. Marcus appreciated her directness. They talked for 2 hours. He told her about his Juilliard days, about Alina, about the accident, and his downward spiral. He described what it felt like to lose everything and slowly find his way back. Sarah listened intently, asking thoughtful questions but never pushing too hard. The article ran 3 days later. It was beautifully written, focusing on Marcus's musical journey while treating his personal tragedy with respect and sensitivity. The headline read, From Juilliard to the Streets and Back, Marcus Wilder's Journey Through Music and Loss. The response was overwhelming. The concert, which had been slowly selling tickets, sold out within hours of the article's publication. Mrs. Castellano had to move the venue to a larger hall to accommodate demand. People from Marcus's past started reaching out. Former classmates, teachers, even his old agent, Richard Pemberton. Richard's call came as a surprise. Marcus hadn't expected to hear from him after disappearing and breaking their contract. I'm not calling to guilt-trip you, Richard said. I'm calling because I never stopped believing in you. And I'm calling to say that if you want representation again, I'm here. No pressure. Just an open door. Marcus was moved by the offer but told Richard he needed time. He wasn't ready to think about contracts and management yet. First, he needed to prove to himself that he could still do this, that he could stand on a stage and perform without falling apart. The nightmares started about 2 weeks before the concert. Marcus would dream he was on stage, but when he sat at the piano, his hands wouldn't work, or he would start playing, and the keys would make no sound. Or, worst of all, Alina would be in the audience, watching him with disappointed eyes. He would wake up sweating, his heart racing. David noticed the dark circles returning under his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. You're psyching yourself out, David said gently. You need to remember why you're doing this. Not for the people watching, not to prove anything. For yourself. For Alina, for the love of music. David was right, but knowing it intellectually didn't make the anxiety go away. Marcus increased his practice time, sometimes playing until his hands cramped. He was chasing perfection, trying to guarantee that nothing could go wrong. Mrs. Castellano came to visit him at the studio one afternoon. She sat in the recording room while he played through his entire program. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. That was technically flawless, she finally said. Every note perfect, every phrase precisely shaped. But Marcus, you've lost something in your pursuit of perfection. You're playing safe. The performance at Bellissimo was special because you were vulnerable. You weren't trying to be perfect. You were just trying to be honest. Her words hit him hard. She was right. In his fear of failure, he had started to play defensively, protecting himself rather than opening up. What if I fall apart on stage? Marcus asked. What if I can't handle it? Then you fall apart, Mrs. Castellano said simply, and you pick yourself up and continue. That's what real artists do. They risk failure because the alternative is playing it safe, and safe art touches no one. That night, Marcus sat alone at the Steinway. Instead of practicing his program, he played whatever came to mind. He played songs his mother had taught him as a child. He played improvisations, letting his fingers wander where they wanted. He played the pieces that Alina had loved most, the ones that were too painful to touch before. As he played, he cried. Not the desperate sobs of early grief, but quieter tears of acceptance and release. He was never going to be the person he was before Alina died. That Marcus was gone, and there was no bringing him back. But maybe he could be someone new, someone who carried his scars but wasn't defined by them. 3 days before the concert, a package arrived at the studio. It was from Professor Hartley. Inside was a leather-bound book of handwritten musical notations and teaching notes. The professor had made during Marcus's time at Juilliard. On the first page, Professor Hartley had written a new inscription, to Marcus, who has learned that the greatest music comes not from perfect technique, but from a heart that has known both joy and sorrow. Play with the wisdom you've earned. With pride and affection, Th. Marcus held the book to his chest and felt something shift inside him. The fear was still there, but so was something else. Determination. Purpose. A sense that whatever happened at the concert, he would face it honestly. The final rehearsal took place in the actual hall where he would perform. The Preston Bradley Hall was magnificent, with its massive Tiffany dome casting colored light across the marble floor. The acoustics were superb. And the Steinway Concert Grand they had brought in for him was one of the finest instruments he had ever played. Marcus ran through parts of his program, testing the sound, getting comfortable with the space. David sat in the middle of the hall, listening. Mrs. Castellano was there too, along with Jennifer Hartley, who had flown in from New York to support him. When Marcus finished his rehearsal, the small group applauded. He looked out at them from the stage, imagining the full audience that would be there in 2 days. The thought no longer filled him with pure terror. Instead, he felt ready. Not confident exactly, but ready. Ready to share his story through music, ready to honor Elena's memory, ready to take the first real step toward whatever came next. The morning of the concert, Marcus woke to sunlight streaming through his window and the sound of rain pattering against the glass. He lay still for a moment, listening to the rhythm of the drops, finding patterns in their irregular beat. His hands felt steady, his mind felt clear. The crippling anxiety he had expected was absent, replaced by a calm sense of purpose. He went through his morning routine slowly and deliberately. Shower, shave, coffee, light breakfast. He avoided looking at his phone, knowing it would be full of well-wishes and messages that would only make him more nervous. Instead, he sat at the small table in his apartment and wrote a letter to Alina. The words flowed easily. He told her about everything that had happened since that night at Bellissimo. He told her about David's kindness, Mrs. Castellano's faith in him, Professor Hartley's forgiveness. He told her he was sorry for wasting so much time in grief, but he also acknowledged that maybe that time had been necessary. Maybe he needed to hit bottom before he could climb back up. He wrote about the concert, about his fears and hopes. He told her he was playing for her tonight, but also for himself. And for everyone who had ever loved music the way they had. When he finished, he folded the letter and placed it in his jacket pocket. He would carry her words close to his heart as he performed. David picked him up at 4 in the afternoon. The concert wasn't until 7:30, but they wanted plenty of time to prepare. In the car, David seemed more nervous than Marcus. "How are you feeling?" David asked for probably the 10th time. "I'm okay," Marcus said honestly. "Whatever happens tonight, I'm grateful for it. A month ago, I was sleeping in a shelter. Tonight, I'm playing in one of Chicago's most beautiful halls. That's enough." When they arrived at Preston Bradley Hall, the transformation was complete. The space had been set up beautifully, with rows of elegant chairs, professional lighting, and programs printed on thick, cream-colored paper. Marcus's name was on those programs, along with the pieces he would perform. Seeing it made everything feel real. The technical crew was still making adjustments to the lighting and sound. Marcus went to the green room backstage, where his concert suit hung waiting for him. As he changed into it, adjusting his tie and cufflinks, he caught sight of himself in the full-length mirror. The man looking back at him was someone he recognized but hadn't seen in years. Polished, professional, ready. But this time, there was something more in his eyes. Experience depth, the kind of wisdom that could only come from suffering and surviving. People began arriving early. Through a crack in the curtain, Marcus watched the hall fill up. He recognized faces from the viral video comments. The man who had laughed at him initially, looking somewhat sheepish. The hostess from Bellissimo, dressed elegantly for the evening. Antonio and Giuseppe from the restaurant. Bringing a large group of people with them, Mrs. Castellano arrived with an entourage, settling into the front row with the bearing of royalty. Professor Hartley came in, moving slowly but with dignity, and Marcus felt his throat tighten at the sight of his old mentor. Jennifer was there too, along with several other people from Juilliard, faces he hadn't seen in years. But there were also complete strangers. People who had seen the video and been moved by his story. Music lovers who came because they believed in second chances. Young students who looked at him as inspiration, proof that it was possible to fall and rise again. 5 minutes, the stage manager called out. David squeezed Marcus's shoulder. "You've got this. Just play like you played that first night, honest and real." Marcus nodded and walked to the wings of the stage. He could hear the murmur of the audience, the rustling of programs, the anticipation in the air. His heart was beating fast now, but it was excitement rather than fear. The lights dimmed. The audience quieted. The stage manager gave him the signal. Marcus walked onto the stage. The applause that greeted him was warm and sustained. He stood for a moment, acknowledging it with a bow, then took his seat at the magnificent Steinway. The bench was positioned perfectly. The lights were right. Everything was as it should be. He placed his hands on the keys and closed his eyes for just a moment, centering himself. He thought of Alina, of all the times they had played together, all the joy music had brought to their life. He thought of his mother teaching him his first scales. He thought of Professor Hartley's patient instruction. He thought of everyone who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. Then he began to play. The opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the hall. It was the same piece he had played at Bellissimo, but this time the conditions were perfect. The acoustics of the hall brought out every nuance. The quality of the instrument allowed for incredible dynamic range and tonal color. And Marcus, freed from the desperate hunger and exhaustion of that first night, could fully inhabit the music. The audience disappeared. The hall disappeared. There was only Marcus and the piano and the music flowing between them. His fingers danced across the keys with confidence born from thousands of hours of practice, but also with the emotional depth that came from having truly lived. Each phrase breathed naturally. The soft passages were whisper quiet, drawing the audience in. The louder sections had power without harshness. This was the Marcus that Professor Hartley had trained, but refined by fire, tempered by loss, deepened by experience. When the final note of the nocturne faded, There was a moment of absolute silence. Then the applause erupted, genuine and enthusiastic. Marcus opened his eyes, returning to the present moment. He saw faces looking at him with wonder and appreciation. No one was laughing now. He continued with his program. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata came next, that familiar masterpiece that everyone knew. Marcus played it not to show off his technique, but to illuminate the profound melancholy at its heart. In the third movement, his fingers flew across the keys in the rapid passages. But even in the speed, there was clarity and purpose. Rachmaninoff's prelude in C-sharp minor followed. The famous opening chords rang out powerfully, filling the hall with their dramatic intensity. This piece was a favorite among pianists, but also one of the most overplayed. Marcus needed to make it fresh, to find something new in these well-worn phrases. He thought about his own journey from darkness to light, and he let that narrative shape his interpretation. The brooding, powerful opening became his time on the streets. The middle section, with its slightly more hopeful melody, was the moment at Bellissimo when everything changed. And the return to the main theme at the end was not a defeat but an acknowledgement. Accepting of shadows as part of the complete picture. The audience seemed to understand. He could feel their attention, their emotional engagement. This wasn't just a performance. It was a conversation, a sharing of human experience through the universal language of music. After the Rachmaninoff, there was an intermission. Marcus retreated to the green room, where David was waiting with water and a towel. "That was extraordinary," David said, his eyes shining. "Marcus, do you realize what you're doing out there? You're not just playing notes. You're telling a story." Professor Hartley came backstage during the intermission. The old man embraced Marcus tightly, tears in his eyes. "I knew it," the professor said. "I knew that if you ever found your way back, you would be magnificent. Not despite what you've been through, but because of it. You've become the artist I always believed you could be." Marcus couldn't speak. He just held on to his old teacher, feeling the weight of approval he hadn't realized he needed so desperately. The second half of the program featured Schubert and Debussy. Schubert's Impromptu in G-flat major was lyrical and flowing, requiring a delicate touch. Marcus played it with tenderness, thinking of quiet moments with Alina, of mornings waking up together, of simple happiness that seemed so precious in retrospect. Debussy's Clair de Lune came near the end. It was perhaps too obvious a choice, an overplayed piece that everyone expected, but Marcus didn't care about being original. He cared about being truthful. And the truth was that this piece, with its shimmering, dreamlike quality, perfectly captured how he felt about memory and loss and beauty. As he played the famous opening phrases, he thought about moonlight on water, about things that were beautiful precisely because they were temporary. Alina was gone, but she had existed. Their love had been real. Nothing could take that away from him, not even death. The final piece of his program was his own choice, something he had added at the last minute. It was Beethoven's Fr Elise, the simple piece that nearly every piano student learns early on. Some in the audience might have thought it an odd choice to end such a sophisticated program with such a simple, familiar piece. But Marcus had his reasons. This was the first piece he had ever learned all the way through as a child. It was the piece his mother had praised him for mastering. It was a piece Alina had loved, had hummed while doing dishes or reading a book. It represented beginnings, innocence, the pure joy of making music before it became complicated by ambition and career and loss. He played it simply, without embellishment or showing off. Just the melody, clear and pure. A reminder that sometimes the most profound truths were the simplest ones. Music was beautiful. Life was precious. It was possible to start again. When the final notes faded, Marcus sat still for a long moment. Then he stood and faced the audience. They were already on their feet, applauding thunderously. Some were crying openly. Others were shouting, "Bravos!" The ovation went on and on. Marcus took bow after bow as the standing ovation continued. Flowers were brought to the stage, bouquets that people had prepared, hoping for exactly this moment. He was overwhelmed, struggling to process the reception. This was beyond anything he had imagined. Not just polite appreciation, but genuine emotional connection. Finally, as the applause began to subside, Marcus sat back down at the piano. The audience quieted immediately, sensing he had something more to offer. He hadn't planned an encore, but suddenly he knew exactly what he wanted to play. Without announcement or explanation, he began Erik Satie's Gymnopédie No. E. The slow, melancholic melody filled the hall like a gentle embrace. It was a piece about loneliness and beauty existing side by side, about finding peace in sadness. Marcus played it as a prayer, as a thank you, as a goodbye to the person he had been, and a hello to whoever he was becoming. When it ended, the silence was profound. Then the applause returned, softer this time, but no less meaningful. Marcus stood, bowed one final time, and left the stage. Backstage, he was immediately surrounded by people. David, Mrs. Castellano, Professor Hartley, Jennifer Mill, and dozens of others all wanted to congratulate him, to touch him, to be part of this moment. Marcus tried to thank everyone, but the words felt inadequate. How do you thank people for believing in you when you didn't believe in yourself? There are people outside who want to meet you, David said. Fans, journalists, even some record label representatives. How much do you want to do tonight? Marcus thought about it. A month ago, he would have run from this attention, hidden from the spotlight. But tonight, he felt different. These people had given him their attention, their time, their emotions. The least he could do was acknowledge that, "I'll meet whoever wants to meet me," Marcus said. The reception line lasted over an hour. People waited patiently to shake his hand, to tell him how his music had moved them. A young woman told him she had been considering quitting piano, but his story inspired her to keep trying. An elderly man said Marcus's performance reminded him of why he had fallen in love with music 60 years ago. Antonio and Giuseppe presented him with a gift, a framed photograph from that first night at Bellissimo. Marcus sitting at their piano, looking lost and desperate, before he had begun to play. Underneath, they had written, "Where it all began again." The man who had laughed at Marcus that first night approached nervously. "I owe you an apology," he said, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I judged you without knowing anything about you. I'm sorry." Marcus shook his hand. "We all make judgments. What matters is being willing to change our minds when we're wrong." Among the well-wishers was a young girl, maybe 10 years old, clutching a worn piano book. She looked up at Marcus with wide eyes. "My mum says you were homeless," the girl said, with the brutal honesty of children. "But you played so beautiful. How did you stay good at piano when you didn't have a piano?" Marcus knelt down to her level. "The music was always here," he said, tapping his chest over his heart. "Even when I couldn't play, it was still inside me, waiting. You don't need a piano every day to be a pianist. You need to love music enough that it becomes part of who you are." The girl nodded solemnly, as if he had revealed a great truth. Her mother, standing behind her, mouthed thank you to Marcus. When the crowd finally thinned, Marcus found himself alone with Professor Hartley. The old man had waited patiently, letting everyone else have their moment first. "Walk with me," the professor said. They left the hall and walked slowly through the Chicago streets. The rain had stopped, leaving everything clean and fresh. The city lights reflected in puddles on the sidewalk. "I need to tell you something," Professor Hartley said. "When you disappeared 3 years ago, I blamed myself. I thought perhaps I had pushed you too hard, had too high expectations. I wondered if the pressure I put on you contributed to your breakdown." Professor No Marcus started to protest. "Let me finish," the professor said gently. "I carried that guilt for a long time. But tonight, watching you perform, I realized something. You needed to go through what you went through. Not the tragedy of losing your wife, that was simply cruel fate. But the fall, the struggle, the dark night of the soul. That shaped you." The Marcus who graduated from Juilliard was technically brilliant but emotionally immature. "You played beautifully, but you hadn't truly suffered yet. Tonight, I heard an artist who has been broken and put himself back together. That's irreplaceable." They walked in silence for a while, letting the words settle. "What comes next?" The professor asked. "You can't go back to living above David's studio forever, as kind as he's been." "I don't know," Marcus admitted. Richard, my old agent, wants to represent me again. There's been talk of a recording contract, a small tour. Mrs. Castellano wants me to perform at more venues. But I'm not sure I'm ready for all that. What do you want? The professor asked. Marcus thought about it. What did he want? A month ago, he just wanted food and shelter. A year ago, he wanted to disappear completely. But now? I want to teach, Marcus said, surprising himself. I want to share music with people who are struggling, who think it's too late for them, who have given up. I want to show them that it's never too late, that music can save you if you let it. Professor Hartley smiled. That's good. That's very good. Have you thought about teaching at a school, or privately? I was thinking smaller, Marcus said. Community centers, shelters, places where people wouldn't normally have access to quality music instruction. I lived in those places. I know who's there. Maybe I could make a difference. You already have, the professor said. But yes, I think you could do more. In fact, I might have some connections that could help you set something like that up. Would you be interested in discussing it further? Yes, Marcus said without hesitation. Very much, yes. They talked for another hour, walking through Chicago's streets, making plans. The professor knew people at various arts foundations, community organizations, and music programs. He promised to make introductions, to help Marcus develop a structure for what he wanted to do. When Marcus finally returned to his apartment above the studio, it was past midnight. He was exhausted, but energized. The concert had been a success beyond his wildest dreams. But more importantly, he had discovered a purpose beyond just performing. He wanted to give back, to help others the way David and Mrs. Castellano had helped him. David was waiting up for him, working at his computer. When Marcus came in, David turned with a huge grin. You need to see this, David said, pulling up his laptop. The concert had been professionally recorded, and David had already edited together a short clip and posted it online. In just a few hours, it had gained hundreds of thousands of views. The comments were overwhelmingly positive. People who had seen the original Bellissimo video were praising how far Marcus had come. Professional musicians were analyzing his technique and emotional interpretation. The hashtag Marcus Wilder comeback was trending on social media. This is bigger than we thought, David said. Marcus, I've gotten calls from 3 major streaming platforms who want to license your performance. A publisher wants to do a book about your story. Someone wants to make a documentary. This is exploding. Marcus felt dizzy. That's too much. I can't handle all that. You don't have to decide anything tonight, David said calmly. But Marcus, you should know that you're touching people. Really touching them, your story, your music, it's giving people hope. That's a rare and precious thing. Marcus nodded slowly. He understood what David meant. His journey from the depths of despair to tonight's triumph resonated with people because everyone had their own struggles, their own losses, their own moments of giving up. If Marcus could come back from where he'd been, maybe they could too. The next morning, Marcus woke to find his phone full of messages. News outlets wanted interviews. Concert promoters wanted to book him. Former classmates from Juilliard wanted to reconnect. His old agent Richard called to say 3 major labels were interested in signing him, but the message that meant the most was from an unknown number. It was a voice message from someone named Thomas, who explained that he had been living in a shelter for 2 years after losing his job and his family. He had seen Marcus's original video at Bellissimo and had been following his story. I used to play guitar, Thomas said in the message, his voice shaking with emotion. But I sold it years ago when I needed money. After seeing you last night, I went to a music store this morning. I didn't buy anything, just stood there looking at the guitars. The owner asked if he could help, and I told him about you. He let me play one for free, right there in the store. I was terrible. My fingers didn't remember anything, but man, it felt good. It felt like maybe I could get better. Maybe it's not too late for me either. I just wanted to say thank you for showing me that. Marcus listened to the message 3 times, tears streaming down his face. This was why it mattered. Not the fame, or the recognition, or the opportunities. This. helping someone else find their way back to what they loved. He called David down to his apartment and played him the message. "This is what I want to focus on," Marcus said. "Yes, I'll do some concerts. Yes, I'll record an album. But my real work, the thing I want to dedicate myself to, is reaching people like Thomas. People who have given up on their dreams, who think it's too late, who need to hear that second chances are real." David smiled. "Then let's make that happen. We'll be strategic about which opportunities you take. We'll use your platform to do good, not just to make money. I'm with you, whatever you decide." Over the next few weeks, Marcus's life transformed in ways both exciting and overwhelming. He did select interviews, always steering the conversation toward hope and second chances rather than dwelling on his lowest moments. He signed with a small ethical record label that believed in his mission. He began planning a modest tour of unconventional venues, community centers, rehabilitation facilities, schools in underserved areas. Mrs. Castellano became his unofficial patron, using her considerable wealth and connections to establish the Alina Wilder Music Foundation. Named after Marcus's late wife, the foundation would provide instruments, lessons, and opportunities to people who couldn't otherwise afford them. Professor Hartley helped him design a curriculum for teaching music to adults who had never played or who had given up years ago. The focus wasn't on technical perfection, but on the joy and healing that music could provide. Marcus moved into a small apartment of his own, modest but comfortable. He kept his life simple, remembering too well how it felt to have nothing. He donated a significant portion of his concert earnings to homeless shelters and addiction recovery programs. 6 months after the concert at Preston Bradley Hall, Marcus stood in front of a community center on Chicago's South Side. The building was old and weathered, with faded paint and windows that had seen better days. Inside, 30 people sat in folding chairs, ranging from teenagers to senior citizens. They had all signed up for the free music program offered through the Alina Wilder Music Foundation. Marcus looked at the faces before him. Some showed skepticism, some curiosity, some desperate hope. He recognized that last expression. It was the same one he had worn when he stood outside Bellissimo, hungry and defeated, offering to play for food. "My name is Marcus," he began, deliberately not mentioning his last name or his recent fame. "I'm here to teach you about music, but more importantly, to share with you what music has taught me. It doesn't matter if you've never touched an instrument before, or if you played years ago and stopped, or if you think you're too old or too broken to learn. Music doesn't care about any of that. Music just wants to be played." He spent the first hour telling his story, the whole story. Not the sanitized version he gave to journalists, but the raw truth. The accident, the guilt, the years of drinking and homelessness, the despair so deep he sometimes wished he wouldn't wake up. He told them about standing outside that restaurant, about the laughter, about finding his way back one note at a time. "I'm not special," Marcus said. "I'm not stronger or braver than any of you. I just didn't give up on the one thing that made me feel alive. And that's all I'm asking you to do. Find that thing, whether it's music or something else, and hold on to it. Let it pull you forward." A woman in her 50s raised her hand. "What if we're not good at it? What if we try and fail?" Marcus smiled. "Then you fail. And then you try again. I've failed more times than I can count, at music and at life. But the only real failure is not trying at all." For the next 2 hours, he introduced them to basic piano concepts. The foundation had donated several keyboards for the program, and Marcus moved from student to student, showing them how to position their hands, how to find middle C, how to play simple scales. One of his students was a young man named Derek who had been released from prison 3 months earlier. He had thick scars on his hands from an accident years ago, and he was convinced he couldn't play. "My fingers don't work right," Derek said, frustrated after several attempts at a simple exercise. Marcus sat beside him. "Look at my hands," he said, holding them up. "See these? They shook so badly from alcohol withdrawal that I couldn't hold a coffee cup. I had to relearn everything. Your fingers work just fine. You just need to be patient with them." Derek tried again, and this time managed to play a simple 5-note scale. The look of wonder on his face was something Marcus would never forget. An elderly woman named Rose had played piano as a child but stopped when she got married at 18, 60 years ago. "My husband didn't think it was important," she explained. "He's gone now, and I always regretted giving it up." Marcus helped her remember what she had forgotten. As her fingers found the keys again, tears rolled down her weathered face. "I didn't think I'd ever do this again," she whispered. The classes became the highlight of Marcus's week. Yes, he still performed concerts. His first album, simply titled Return, had been released and received critical acclaim. He had performed in several major cities, always to sold-out crowds. But nothing compared to the satisfaction of helping someone discover or rediscover the joy of making music. The media attention around Marcus eventually calmed to a manageable level. He was no longer a viral sensation, but a respected musician with a meaningful story. He did a TED Talk about second chances that got millions of views. He wrote articles about music education and its power to heal trauma. He became an advocate for homeless services and addiction recovery programs. Professor Hartley came to visit him at the community center one afternoon. The old man sat in the back of the room, watching Marcus teach. Afterwards, they had coffee together at a nearby diner. "You've found your calling," the professor said. "I'm proud of you, Marcus, not because you're performing again, though that's wonderful, but because you've taken your pain and transformed it into something that helps others. That's the mark of a true artist." "I couldn't have done it without you," Marcus said. "You never gave up on me, even when I gave up on myself." "That's what teachers do," the professor replied. "We hold on to hope for our students until they're ready to hold it for themselves." On the one-year anniversary of his performance at Bellissimo, Marcus returned to the restaurant. Antonio and Giuseppe had planned a special celebration, inviting everyone who had been there that rainy November night. Mrs. Castellano attended, as did David, Jennifer, and many others who had been part of Marcus's journey back. The restaurant had framed the viral video and hung it on the wall, along with photos from Marcus's concert and news clippings about his work with the foundation. It had become a popular destination for music lovers visiting Chicago. Marcus played again that night, the same Chopin nocturne that had started everything, but this time, he played it not as a desperate man begging for food, but as someone who had found his way home. The notes were the same, but the meaning was different. It was a celebration rather than a cry for help. Afterwards, Antonio presented Marcus with a gift. It was a key to the restaurant. "Your family now," Antonio said. "This place will always be open to you, though I hope you'll never need to play for food again." Marcus accepted the key with gratitude, knowing he would never need to use it, but understanding the symbolic importance of the gesture. Later that evening, Marcus visited Elena's grave for the first time in over a year. He had avoided it for so long, the guilt and pain too overwhelming, but now he felt ready. He sat on the grass beside her headstone and talked to her for hours. He told her about everything that had happened since that night at the restaurant. He told her about the students he was teaching, the lives he was touching, the purpose he had found. He told her he would never stop missing her, but he had learned to live with the loss rather than being destroyed by it. "I think you'd be proud of me," Marcus said quietly. "Not because I'm playing again, but because I'm trying to honor what we had together. You always said music was meant to be shared, that it had the power to heal. You were right. I'm sharing it now, and it's healing me a little more each day." As he stood to leave, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced since before the accident. Elena was gone, and nothing would change that, but her influence on his life, her love of music, her belief in its power to transform, all of that lived on through his work. 2 years after his comeback, Marcus was invited to perform at Carnegie Hall, one of the most prestigious venues in the world. It was the kind of opportunity that would have defined his career in his younger days. But now, while he was honored, he saw it as just one concert among many. No more important than the ones he played at community centers and shelters. The Carnegie Hall performance was magnificent. Critics praised his technical mastery and emotional depth. The audience gave him a 10-minute standing ovation. But the moment that meant the most to Marcus came after the concert, when a young woman approached him with tears in her eyes. 3 years ago, I was homeless, she said. I saw your video from that restaurant, and it gave me hope. I got help, got clean, got my life back. Last year, I started taking piano lessons. Tonight was the first classical concert I've ever attended. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to come back from rock bottom. This was why it all mattered. Not the fame or the recognition or the prestigious venues, but the connections, the hope, the proof that redemption was real. Marcus continued teaching at the community center every week. The program grew, expanding to other locations across Chicago and eventually to other cities. The Alina Welder Music Foundation provided instruments and instruction to thousands of people who might never have had the opportunity otherwise. Derek, the young man who had been convinced his scarred hands couldn't play, became one of Marcus's most dedicated students. He progressed quickly, discovering a natural talent he never knew he had. Eventually, he began helping Marcus teach beginners, sharing his own story of finding hope through music. Rose, the elderly woman who had given up piano 60 years ago, formed a seniors piano group that met weekly to play and socialize. She often said that music had given her a reason to get up in the morning, a purpose in her final years. 5 years after that November night at Bellissimo, Marcus received a letter from Thomas, the man who had left him the voice message about playing guitar at a music store. Thomas wrote that he was no longer homeless, had reconnected with his daughter, and had started his own small music teaching business. He enclosed a photo of himself, holding a guitar, smiling. "You saved my life," Thomas wrote. "Not by being perfect or famous, but by showing me that broken things can be repaired, that it's never too late to start again. I'm passing that message forward now, one student at a time." Marcus kept that letter in his wallet, pulling it out whenever he felt discouraged or wondered if his work mattered. On what would have been Elena's 40th birthday, Marcus commissioned a bench in her favorite park with a plaque that read, "Elena Wilder, who believed music could heal the world." She was right. He sat on that bench often, sometimes playing harmonica, sometimes just sitting quietly, remembering. The grief never fully disappeared, but it transformed into something more bearable. Not a crushing weight, but a tender spot in his heart that reminded him of what he had loved and lost and learned to love again. Marcus never forgot where he came from. Once a month, he volunteered at the shelter where he had stayed during his homeless days. He talked to the residents, played piano for them, shared his story, and listened to theirs. He knew that not everyone would have a dramatic comeback like his. Some would struggle for years, some might never fully recover. But if even one person found hope from hearing his story, it was worth sharing. As he approached his mid-40s, Marcus had become exactly what Alina had always said he would be. Not just a great pianist, but a great human being who used music to make the world a little better. He performed regularly recorded albums, and maintained a successful career. But his real legacy wasn't in concert halls or on recording labels. It was in the students he taught, the lives he touched, the hope he inspired. The viral video from Bellissimo eventually faded from the internet's collective memory, replaced by newer sensations and different stories. But the people who had been there that night never forgot. They told their children and grandchildren about the man who walked in asking to play for food and revealed himself as a genius. More importantly, they told them about what came after, the hard work of rebuilding, the commitment to helping others, the proof that one moment of courage can change everything. Marcus Wilder never took anything for granted again. Every performance, every lesson, every note he played was a gift. He had been given a second chance, and he spent the rest of his life trying to be worthy of it, not through perfection, but through persistence, generosity, and love for the art that had saved him. And somewhere, in whatever place souls go after death, Marcus liked to imagine Alina listening to his music, smiling, and saying what she always used to say when he played something beautiful. "That's my Marcus. That's exactly right."